Welcome to another session of INGSA Horizon Series interviews. Today, we are indeed very honored to have Dr. Antonio Gabriel La Viña, who will be here to delve into the timely issues of climate change and biodiversity loss, especially in the context of science advice in the Southeast Asian region. Dr. Antonio, or as we know him as Dean Tony, is a leader, teacher, thinker, human rights, environmental, and climate justice lawyer, and also a social entrepreneur. He is the Associate Director for Climate Policy and International Relations of Manila Observatory, which he has led as Executive Director from 2016 to 2018 and 2020 to 2021. He was the former Dean of the Ateneo de Manila University School of Government and is currently the Chair of Jurisprudence and Legal Philosophy Department at the Philippine Judicial Academy of the Supreme Court of the Philippines. He is also a renowned scholar, having published many books and articles, and he has led many negotiations for the Philippines for climate change and biodiversity. He's also a council member of the Southeast Asia Science Advice CSUN Network, which aims to structure and strengthen direct evidence to policy making pathways in Southeast Asia, particularly on areas of shared regional concern within the framework of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And really the CSUN over the last 1 year has become such an exciting project for INGSA Asia. And we're really lucky to have Dean Tony with us today. And welcome, Dean Tony. So I'll start off with our first question. We just had COP26, and of course, call it a failure, call it a partial success. My question is, there was certainly a very palpable sense that the voice of Southeast Asians was rather muted at COP26. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Professor Abi, for having me here for this series. I feel quite strongly about the link between science and climate change and biodiversity, and feel very strongly about our region. Answering your question, that's always a challenge for Southeast Asia in international conferences of the conventions, because we do not negotiate as a group of ASEAN or Southeast Asian states. We are present, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam. Some of these countries are actually quite active in COP26 and also in all the other climate and biodiversity conferences, but we don't really coordinate with each other in hearing our voice, in speaking a common voice. We have processes in the ASEAN to come up with common action plans, with common principles. But for example, when we went to Glasgow, we kind of left that behind and we're on our own. And that means we don't have a lot of influence as a region compared, for example, to the African group or the Alliance of Small and Island States or the GRULAC, Latin American, South American countries. So we do have to get our act together up to now.
So, I think that's really good and reassuring that obviously the presence was there and certainly input was provided from the perspective of Southeast Asians. But I guess my question would be, why is it that the Southeast Asian countries, especially we have had ASEAN, and we're very proud of the many successes of what ASEAN has managed to achieve. What do you think are I guess the impediments or challenges that's affecting the coming together of the voice of ASEAN in championing these causes?
There are inherent reasons, and part of it is we have very different political cultures in our countries. We have democracies in ASEAN. We also have less democratic countries with their own traditions of governance. we have different environmental issues. Philippines, Indonesia, for example, are more archipelagic. Of course, Malaysia is coastal. Singapore is an island. But then you have the Mekong countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar also. They're in mainland. They're in mainland Asia. So here is where science is very important, because science is the one that can link us all better, and that's starting. Many of universities are cooperating with each other. The ASEAN has scientific working groups that are working together, but that doesn't reach to the level of cooperation in international conventions, and that I think is the next step. We need to have an ASEAN position in, for example, on biodiversity, on protected areas, the 30 by 30, for example, goal, or a position on 1.5 or 2 degrees for climate change, for coal, for example, dealing with coal. As you know, we continue to be challenged by the problem of smog. In Southeast Asia, and dealing with pollution, air pollution. So that is something we have to work hard together, by having a common science base and then translating that into political action and policy action.
Yeah, that's interesting though. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think HAZE used to bring many ASEAN countries together to solve that common problem. Something that's been lost since the pandemic. I must say that, we don't talk about HAZE.
Exactly.
And that's also,
Exactly. I mean, the HAZE is a good issue where you should find common ground. But I think that the political actions that need to come from the scientific findings has been inadequate and needs improvement, certainly.
But yeah, no, I would think that recognizing that there's actually local action as well as some regional action, and I think having experienced leaders like yourselves, and I'm sure the kind of work that you did in the Kyoto Protocol negotiations will certainly help to alleviate the Southeast Asian voice.
Yes.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point about the use of evidence and the use of scientific evidence, essentially, in informing policymakers when it actually comes to specific positioning of what the country or region wants to do with regards to a grand challenge like biodiversity of climate change. Part of that perceived political inertia, as we call it, may be because of the inability to harmonize between the conflict of, for example, in the context of environmental protection, what we see in the palm oil industry, that socioeconomic development and protection of the environment are dichotomous. It's mutually exclusive. If you choose socioeconomic development, the environment is going to be affected. And if you choose the environmental protection, the socioeconomic development, and it's not helping the fact that the Western world, where much of the environmental degradation had happened in the past, now in a position of economic power. But you have these Southeast Asian countries with such great aspirations to grow their economies, and now there's a perceived holding back of that progress in the name of protection of environment, or what have you. Yeah. So maybe could you give us your thoughts on this perceived dichotomy, and what science actually can help in harmonizing this polarizing view?
Yeah, that's a really great framing that you gave of the dichotomy. But the dichotomy is really more apparent than real. I mean, we know now that if you do not take care of your biodiversity, of your land, of your forest, of your air, your environment, of your climate, you will lose a lot in terms of development options. That is actually not good for development if you do not take care of your environment. In the same way that just paying attention to environmental conservation without looking at how sustainable use can be maximized can also be bad for the environment, because when people are poor, when countries are poor, that is the best excuse for destroying the environment. So in other words, you actually have to pay attention to both sides, that in fact it's good economic strategy to protect your ecosystems, and it is good environmental strategy to develop your society so that people do not have to resort to destroying nature and ecosystems in order to survive. Now, you're right. The key to resolve this, or the key to see this dichotomy as apparent and not real, and in fact to be able then to reconcile them, is science. Because it's the science that will tell you that the more you destroy your ecosystem, the more you are destroying your options for development, and especially for the future. And it is science that tells us, and here science is both natural science, but also the social sciences like economics will tell us that an environmental strategy that does not allow for economic development is doomed as an environmental strategy, because you will not be able to then protect it. You will have no resources. If there's no earnings, there's no profit, no economic gain from using the environment, from using your environmental assets, then there's no money to preserve it, no money to keep it intact, or maybe intact is not the right word, to keep it alive and growing and sustainable. So you have to look at it from both sides, and science allows you to do that.
Yeah. I guess before we talk about the responsibilities of the developed world and the developing world, what about the science? So the fact that we recognize that the science, is the solution to trying to harmonize, this conflict, and in your work with the UN Millennium Development Goals assessment, the pandemic, as you say, was already foreseen as a consequence of our failure to maintain what we call today planetary health. But in the context of gaps in science, at least within the region, are there specific areas that we certainly need to improve in the context of investment in the type of science, so that we have the evidence to provide that advice?
Yes, of course. We need to have better, for example, scenario analysis. I mean, moving forward, that we can actually project what would happen if, for example, we lose ecosystems, or we lose species. No? Climate change is a good example, and I'll segue to that, because what are we being told now about climate change, particularly in the 6th assessment report? We're basically being told that the Earth is changing, and it could change, in fact, even more if business as usual continues. And the physical changes are what? Enormous. Terrible even is the right term for that. Some of which would probably be difficult to adjust or to adapt to. You need science to be able to do that, and we need to have better science to be able to project that. I mean, the science of loss and damage is a very new science, Professor Abi, but it's I actually think it's the most important science now that needs to be developed everywhere, because unless we know what the immediate impact of climate change is and when I say immediate, in the next year, the next disaster, the next 5 years, all our planning for the future is nothing. We won't be able to plan properly. We won't be able to mitigate even properly. But there's such a we have good projections of climate in the future, a little bit better projections of impacts in the medium term, but we have very little knowledge of what will actually happen tomorrow when a new kind of storm hits us. Like in the Philippines, like December, we got hit by a Category 5 storm. We don't usually get hit by Category 5. We usually get hit by Category 3, sometimes Category 4. It was beyond the pale of imagination of the responders. So everyone prepared for Category 3. But we got a Category 5, and the impacts of all of that are really beyond imaginable, right? So I think you need to use science now to be able to really get us into a better place, so that when it happens again, as it will happen again, right? Regardless of what we do, we don't have to wait for 1.5 or 2. 1.1 itself will create these devastating impacts, and we need to understand that, so we're able to respond to it and be in a position to deal with 1.5 and 2 and 2.5. Well, I don't think we can deal with 2.5, to be honest. Even 1.5 is a challenge, but you cannot even deal with that if you're dealing with loss and damage right away, immediately now.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about preparedness and resilience, right? And all of this obviously requires significant amount of resources to invest into it. So, you do talk about, the need for appreciating, in the context of international responsibilities, that, individual countries or organizations have common but differentiated responsibilities. Could you perhaps elaborate a little?
Yes. And what I would emphasize here is there's a reason why we call it global change, whether it's climate or biodiversity, or any other major, ecosystem change or impacts on ecosystems, because the impacts are global, but the causes are also global. It's global forces, economic, social, physical forces that is driving this change in this biodiversity change, this biodiversity loss and extinction, this crisis, as well as the climate emergency. So let's be clear about that, which means the response has to be global. And it's global also in two ways, which is that everyone must respond, but in their own way, in their own capacity and their own responsibility. And that's why we invoke CBDR, those common but differentiated responsibilities. Those who are historically responsible for the problem we're facing in climate and biodiversity have the obligation to act and lead in acting, lead first, and also has the obligation to provide resources, financial, technology, capacity building to countries, and these are developing countries, that have the least responsibility, but are facing the earliest and the most serious impacts. I mean, and I think it's very, very important to emphasize that. That's a live principle, negotiated and accepted in the Rio Earth Summit, in the Rio Declaration, constantly reaffirmed, right? Of course, there's some caveat now about that, in the sense that a country like China, for example, should no longer be treated necessarily as a developing country, because China is the second, if not the most wealthiest country in the world, or second most wealthy, certainly second or the most powerful country in the world. They have their own resources. They are now contributing as much as the big developed country. So I would always have that caveat that CBDR lives for most developing countries, but there are some developing countries who have graduated from being considered poor countries and developing countries. Now, with that caveat, then it's very clear what has to be done, right? Developed countries must take the lead in acting, and developed countries must provide resources, financial, technology, and capacity building to developing countries. And within developing countries, of course, you make a distinction between, the biggest developed countries like China. Although India, for example, is as big as China in many ways, but still is a poor country. I don't think you can make the case against India and say that, well, India is as rich as China or the US. The US has lots of poor people, much more poor people statistically in India. But middle income countries like us, like Malaysia, many of the Southeast Asian states are middle income countries, can do a lot of things on their own, but we still need, climate finance, we still need technology transfer. And the same also with countries like Thailand and Singapore, etc. But there are countries in Southeast Asia that need assistance more than us. I mean, Vietnam, Cambodia in particular, Laos, PDR, Myanmar. Those are least developed countries that actually need assistance. So there's this distinction you have to make. But overall, the principle is very clear. The developed world, the developed countries have a responsibility to us.
Great. I think, I like this idea of differentiated responsibilities and the idea, ultimately, I think this whole Omicron variant, has shown us that we can all be focused about vaccinating our population within our boundaries. But if you don't ensure equity, of vaccines or, just about everything else, it will certainly, impact us in one way or another.
I agree. The pandemic injustice is really, I call it an advance receipt or evidence of climate injustice, which will just worsen. It has postponed, in fact, the things you have to do to address climate injustice, but it is clearly something we will be facing more permanently in the future if we don't act decisively.
Absolutely. And talking about acting decisively, I think the one thing that we certainly cannot, take lightly is there is a gap between, generations in the context of a sense of urgency to respond to these grand challenges. And, whatever the reason is, I think there seems to be an increase in youth activism and this whole generation of young people who are out there championing the UN Millennium Goals, or now the UN Sustainable Goals, or planetary health. I guess the question is, we know that there is this desire, there's this energy, there is all that amazing intellectual potential that we can harness from our young people. And ASEAN, although countries like Malaysia are soon going to be an aging country, has a huge number of young people. And also the scientific community, for the most part, is also relatively young.
Yes.
So, Prof, Dean Tony, I mean, you have been involved in this whole interface between policymakers, the scientists, and as the dean, I'm sure you engage with thousands, if not millions, of young people, throughout your tenure. How can we ensure that the engagement of youth in science advice, truly addresses, this urgent need to respond to the challenges?
I would say, and echo what you said, the importance of the youth and the engagement of the youth. I actually see that in our region, see that in my country a lot, and that's because they see that what is at stake is the world that they will inherit. The key, Professor Abi, is science education and also popular education, popular science education. I mean, obviously, we want many of the youth to become scientists, and there are many of them that will want to do that. But you also want all of them to be science literate, right? Not to fall into the problem. Of course, is the internet and social media in particular is so prone to disinformation, misinformation, fake news, right? Terrible views. So they need to be literate, science literate, to see beyond the fake news on the pandemic, on climate change. And so the thing is that we have a lot of work to do in terms of that. I mean, getting young people to become scientists and getting all young people to be science literate. But I find that they are easy to educate. They're easy to engage with, much more difficult with older people. You know, fake news proliferate more among older people because I think nothing else but fears. Old people have a lot more fears than younger people. I mean, and so they're easily agitated. And they don't know the internet as much as young people who, you know, have seen all of this and are kind of skeptical necessarily for the first news. But because older people don't do that as much, they tend to believe what they read, especially if it's from a trusted source that they have, right? So for young people, what we want is for them to get into a habit of what are the trusted sources. So for example, my organization, the Manila Observatory, is one of the oldest scientific research institutions of the Philippines. But we are trying very hard to communicate in real time to younger people on what impacts of climate change are, what we could do, not to catastrophize it, but actually to be solutions oriented about it.
And so talking about the work that you do at the observatory, I mean, how much do you engage with the universities and the knowledge generators, essentially the scientific community within the Philippines in then taking that local knowledge that you get to then be transferred to the general public?
Well, we're fortunate because we're actually inside the university, even if we're separate from that university, the Ateneo de Manila University. But many of us in the observatory are also professors in several universities. I myself is a professor in actually more than a dozen universities since I teach adjunct now and no longer full-time in one university. And we bring a lot of people, a lot of young people to the observatory. Before the pandemic, we have quite a lot of people that come there to be exposed to things. On Valentine's Day, we have parties in the roof deck to show them the stars and the and the moon and other planets. Science education is really critical. It's a prerequisite of getting science also to be a staple for policy making, because these young people will be the decision makers one day, and if you did not familiarize them with science, they will not turn to science for policy decisions when they're older already and they are the ones that make the decisions for society.
Yeah, no, and I've had the privilege of meeting your secretary Fortunato de la Peña, from the Department of Science and Technology, and I must say I'm very impressed by the schools that are actually run by the Department of Science and Technology. And a couple of students came to Malaysia a couple of years ago, and they won this scientific competition, and I was like very, very impressed by what they actually taught at the school. It was actually at the level of what we might teach at universities, and exposing this kids at such an early age obviously brings amazing benefits.
Yeah, and it's and these are they call the science high schools, the Philippine Science High School system, and they're all over the country. They're not just in Manila. They used to be just in Manila, but in the last 20 years, the government has really done a good job across different presidents, across different administrations to have these schools all over the country. And not only that, they are being replicated by local governments. The big local governments have now at least one science high school. So that's really great. I agree with you that the future is bright. These are the best students, the best young minds of the Philippines.
Yeah, brilliant. And so, I guess the question is, what about those in the university now? I mean, and especially you're talking about your young lecturers, your young professors, who are early, middle career researchers, right? How active are they in engaging with policymakers? And are there any specific platforms that are available for them to engage?
Yes, but not enough. Let me just put it that way. I mean, there's opportunity to do research collaboration, opportunities to learn pedagogies of teaching science. And there's several, the Department of Science and Technology uh, has that. But I think all of us in the field recognize that there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, I think, to be honest, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore are so way ahead of us in this particular area. I think Philippines and Indonesia are probably at par with each other. Vietnam, by the way, is catching up all of us, by the way. Quite impressive how they've dealt, especially with this. And so science education in Vietnam is at a fantastic stage. And if you're not careful, they'll overtake all of us, right? Because it's a very young society also. Vietnam is such a young, so many young people and so much energy. So there, but of course, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, at least developed countries are need to also do a lot of catch up.
Great. Dean Tony, we are coming to end to our interview. And, on that note about, really thinking about how we can have a collective voice of Asia or ASEAN even, as well as the need to really be able to start charging that voice so that we are able to not only make those changes, but making sure that those changes are backed with the kind of science advice, strong evidence-informed decisions. Would you like to share, perhaps your closing message to our young or, listeners who feel young? Listening to you, I'm so excited and engaged because, I hope, that I would be able to also have the kind of impact that you have had and continue to inspire people. So perhaps you could share your thoughts.
Sure. The future is bright, I think, for this field and for getting science into the center of policy making and including on economic decisions. There is no choice. The thing is, there's no choice because the biggest challenges that our societies face now, the immediate challenge is the pandemic. To exit out of this pandemic, we have to have good, solid science. We've seen that now, right? I mean, we have to have good, solid science to be able to get out of this pandemic economically as a society. And so we need to really deploy that science and collaborate with each other to do that. And then, as I said, there's climate change that's real, that's happening now. The loss and damage impact we have to assess and respond to now, but also is for the future. We need to adapt to that. We also need to mitigate because we can never adapt enough for what's coming. And so that requires also science that cannot be solved, right, by conjuring magic, out of ignorance, out of nothing. We have to have a solid understanding of what's happening, of what our options are. And so those of us who are in the field, quite honestly, I would have wanted to retire already since I'm more than 60 in the Philippines. That's we have a young retirement age, but seeing the things that have to be done and all the young people that's actually excited to engage in this, I feel like it's not right to do that. And while I'm certainly willing to stand aside leadership and other things for younger people to take over, people like me and of course Dr. Zachary of Malaysia, my good friend, we should stay on to be able to guide and to help and to bring us to a better place. So I'm actually very, all the problems that we have, I'm actually very hopeful and very inspired. It was much worse 20 years ago. I started on the conventions, climate and biodiversity 30 years ago in the early 1990s. And believe it or not, I'm going to say that we were in a worse situation then. not in terms of the impacts because that we're seeing now, but in terms of knowledge. In terms of knowledge, we're such a better position now in terms of knowledge, capacity, ideas, much better position now. And now the thing is really to get together and have a political consensus to be able to move forward in the solutions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dean Tony. As they say, if there is hope in future, there is certainly power in the present. And today, I think, you have not only given us hope, but you've also told us that there's actually so much effort that we can actually bring in. And certainly, there's no time for you to retire anytime soon. We really need that voice of experience, the voice of enthusiasm. And thank you so much for sharing your perspectives today. And on behalf of INGSA, we look forward to continuing to engage with you and hopefully inspire everyone here to be part of really helping to enhance the ability to provide the kind of science advice that addresses the challenges that we have adequately.
Thank you.
Dean Tony, thank you so much.
Thank you also.